October 19th, 1982. Two things happened on the same day, 5,000 miles apart. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, the British government switched off the lights on a factory that had employed 2,500 people. In Los Angeles, federal agents burst into a hotel room near the airport and handcuffed the man who had built it. The factory made cars. Beautiful, strange, stainless steel cars with doors that opened toward the sky. The man who built it had once been the most glamorous executive in the American automobile industry. By the end of that single October day, both were finished. And yet, the car never died. Today, that machine is one of the most recognized vehicles in human history. Not because it was fast, not because it sold well, it didn't. Not because the company survived, it didn't. It became immortal because of a movie made 3 years after the factory closed, about a time machine that nobody could afford to build twice. This is the story of the DeLorean DMC-12, built in a war zone, killed in a hotel room, remembered forever. Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1978 to 1982. John Zachary DeLorean was not supposed to fail. He was born in Detroit in 1925, the eldest son of a Romanian immigrant who worked the factory floors of Ford. The city shaped him. The industry called to him. By his 30s, he had climbed inside General Motors faster than almost anyone before him. Not by following the rules, but by bending them just enough to produce results nobody could argue with. In 1964, he gave America the Pontiac GTO. Detroit had never seen anything like it. A muscle car for the masses, raw power at an accessible price. It sold in numbers that stunned the boardroom. The Firebird followed. DeLorean became a legend inside an industry that did not make legends easily. By 1972, he was vice president at General Motors, one of the most powerful men in the most powerful car company on earth. He wore turtlenecks to board meetings. He dated models. He was photographed for magazines. In an industry of gray suits and closed doors, he moved like someone who had already decided the rules did not apply to him. Then in 1973, he walked away. Not fired, not pushed out. He resigned at the peak of his career from the peak of his industry because he could not stomach what General Motors had become. Too slow, too political, too afraid of its own shadow. He had watched the company kill good ideas in committee rooms for years. He was done watching. He wanted to build a car of his own. The concept had lived in his mind for a long time. A sports car unlike anything on the market, not defined by horsepower or racing pedigree, but by something he believed the industry had ignored entirely: longevity, safety, and beauty that did not rust. The body would be stainless steel, unpainted, brushed to a silver finish that would outlast every other car on the road. The doors would open upward. Gull-wing doors, dramatic and unmistakable, the kind of design that made people stop walking and stare. He called it the DMC-12. To build it, he needed $200 million. He had neither the money nor a factory, but he had something that proved in the end to be more dangerous than either: the ability to make people believe in him absolutely. Within 45 days of going public with his plan, he had secured funding commitments. Dealers signed on. Investors wrote checks. Johnny Carson wrote a check. Sammy Davis Jr. wrote a check. The man radiated certainty the way a furnace radiates heat, and people pressed close to feel it. What he needed now was a place to build. He searched the world. Puerto Rico made a serious offer: land, infrastructure, government incentives. Negotiations went deep. A deal was close enough that a Puerto Rican delegation had already checked into their hotel, waiting to finalize terms. DeLorean never showed up. He had received a better call. It came from across the Atlantic, from a government with a problem far more complicated than tax incentives or real estate. And John DeLorean, who had spent his career looking for the unconventional answer, boarded a plane and flew toward the most unlikely factory location in the history of the automobile industry. He was going to Belfast. To understand what DeLorean was walking into, you have to understand what Belfast was in 1978. The troubles had been burning for nearly a decade. Bombings, assassinations, kneecappings, riots, they were not aberrations. They were the rhythm of daily life. That same year, a provisional IRA bomb detonated at the La Mon restaurant outside Belfast, killing 12 civilians and wounding 30 more. The British Army patrolled the streets in armored vehicles. Checkpoints divided neighborhoods. Children grew up knowing which roads to avoid and which walls belonged to which side. West Belfast, in particular, had been carved into territories. Republican Twinbrook on one side, Unionist Dunmurry on the other. Two communities that shared a geography and almost nothing else, separated by flags, murals, religion, and years of accumulated grief. Unemployment in this part of the city had reached approximately 50% among men. Many had never held a formal job in their lives, not because they were unwilling, because there was nothing to apply for. The factories that had once defined Belfast's industrial identity were gone or dying. The shipyards that built the Titanic were a shadow of what they had been. An entire generation of working men existed in a city that had run out of work. Into this landscape, the British government made a calculation. James Callaghan's Labour government genuinely believed, that unemployment was feeding the violence, that idle men in a war zone were recruits waiting to be claimed. If you could put 2,500 people to work, people from both communities, side by side on the same factory floor, you might not solve the troubles, but you might loosen its grip, just slightly, on one corner of one city. The price tag was $120 million of British taxpayer money, more than half the total startup cost of DeLorean's company. It was not an investment in the automobile industry. It was a bet on peace. DeLorean took the money and signed the deal. Ground was broken in October 1978 on a site called The Cuts in Dunmurry, situated with almost theatrical precision directly on the fault line between the two communities. The factory would draw workers equally from Twinbrook and Dunmurry. And because the reality of Belfast in 1978 made a single shared entrance an act of provocation that neither side could accept, the building was designed with two separate gates, one for each community. A car factory with two front doors. When DeLorean arrived in Belfast to mark the occasion, he brought his full entourage. His wife, Christina Ferrare, a model and television personality of considerable fame, was at his side. The scene, as one observer later wrote, could have been lifted from a Hollywood production. Glamour and stainless steel prototypes and the pocketful of government money, descending on a city that had been living under curfews and bomb warnings. The people of Belfast lined up to watch. What would you make of it? A man like that, in a place like this, promising the future. Most of the workers who would eventually fill that factory had no frame of reference for what he was describing. They had never built cars. They had never worked in manufacturing at any scale. Some had never worked at all. They believed him anyway. 6 months later, the six-building, 660,000 square foot factory was rising from what had recently been a peat bog. 16 months after groundbreaking, it was complete. An achievement that, under any circumstances, would have been remarkable. Under these circumstances, it bordered on the improbable. The test track was laid alongside it. Every DeLorean that came off the line would be driven on that track before it left Dunmurry. Quality control, proof of life. The factory was ready. The workers were hired. The dream, against every reasonable expectation, was taking physical shape in one of the most dangerous cities in Europe. What no one said aloud, and not yet, was that the same fault line the factory straddled was still active. The same communities sharing its two gates were still fighting outside them. The troubles did not pause for groundbreaking ceremonies. The furnaces were lit, the assembly lines were configured, and in the streets beyond the fence, the war continued. January 21st, 1981. The first DeLorean DMC-12 rolled off the assembly line at Dunmurry, and the factory floor erupted. Workers who had never built a car in their lives, men from Twinbrook, men from Dunmurry, men who had spent years staring at unemployment lines, stood and watched a stainless steel sports car with gull-wing doors emerge from their own hands. It was real. They had actually done it. The car itself was unlike anything in production anywhere in the world. The body panels were brushed austenitic stainless steel, SAE 304, the same grade used in industrial equipment and surgical instruments, fixed over a fiberglass underbody mounted on an epoxy-coated steel backbone chassis derived from the Lotus Esprit platform. No paint, no clear coat. Every DeLorean that left Dunmurry looked identical. Silver, angular, otherworldly. The only exceptions were 3 cars plated in 24-karat gold, commissioned as a promotional exercise. The gull-wing doors opened on cryogenically preset torsion bars and nitrogen-charged struts developed by Grumman Aerospace, the same company that built the lunar module. To close them from inside, DMC installed leather pull straps on the lower door panel after discovering that some drivers simply could not reach the handle. The engine sat in the rear, a V6 PRV unit, designed jointly by Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo in the 1970s, producing 130 horsepower. It was not a powerful engine. It was never going to be a powerful engine. But DeLorean had never promised power. He had promised something different. A car that would last, that would not rust, that would look like the future for as long as it existed. On that promise, at least, the car delivered completely. The first cars were shipped from Belfast port within weeks, loaded onto vessels bound for the United States. Dealers had waiting lists. Buyers had placed deposits. Some were paying above the manufacturer's suggested retail price, $25,000, just to move up the queue. The excitement was genuine. The waiting list was real. The factory ran 3 shifts. The test track beside the building was in constant use. Workers drove every car through its paces, over sleeping policemen, around the banking corner, across surfaces designed to simulate the worst roads in America, before signing off on delivery. It was, by the standards of what this workforce had been 1 year earlier, an extraordinary operation. For a few months in 1981, it felt like the bet might actually pay off. October 1981 was the peak. 720 DeLoreans sold in a single month, the best figure the company would ever record. The waiting lists were clearing. The factory was running at pace. In Dunmurry, workers were earning wages that their parents' generation would not have believed possible in this part of Belfast. Then the reviews landed. Road and Track drove the car and published their findings without sentiment. 0 to 60 in 10.5 seconds. The company's own literature had claimed 8.8. The difference was not a rounding error. It was the difference between a sports car and an expensive disappointment. It's not a barn burner, the magazine wrote. Frankly, that's not quick for a sports GT car in this price category. The Chevrolet Corvette, faster, more powerful, more proven, sold for $18,000. The DeLorean cost $25,000. For $7,000 more, the American buyer was getting less performance and a car that, for all its visual drama, could not keep up on a highway entrance ramp. The waiting list began to thin. DeLorean's response to slowing sales was the decision that sealed the company's fate. In the closing months of 1981, with inventory beginning to pile up at dealerships and on the docks at Long Beach, California, the rational move was to cut production, pull back, match supply to demand. Every operations manager in the factory could see the gap opening between what they were building and what America was buying. DeLorean ordered the opposite. He doubled production. His reasoning had a certain internal logic. More cars meant more revenue, and more employees meant more political leverage with the British government, which he believed would continue supporting the factory as long as it remained a significant employer. If Dunmurry grew large enough, London could not afford to let it fail. It was a gamble built on a misreading of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher had taken office in 1979 with no patience for what she considered industrial charity. The DeLorean arrangement had been Callahan's deal, made by a Labour government with priorities she did not share. Official files released years later confirmed that she had been reluctant to extend further loans almost from the moment she arrived in Downing Street. While DeLorean was betting that size would force her hand, she was quietly calculating the cost of walking away. Meanwhile, the cars kept coming off the line. By the end of 1981, the factory had produced approximately 7,500 vehicles. Roughly 3,000 had been sold. The remaining 4,500 sat in storage facilities, on transport ships, and in dealership lots across America. Depreciating, waiting, accumulating carrying costs that compounded with every passing week. The company's break-even point required sales of between 10,000 and 12,000 units per year. The actual annual sales rate by late 1981 was running at roughly half that figure. There was also the quality problem, one that the public was only beginning to understand. The first 400 cars off the Dunmurry line had shipped with defects serious enough to require interception before reaching dealerships. Panel gaps were inconsistent. The original 80-amp alternator could not handle the car's full electrical load. Running lights, heating, and radio simultaneously would gradually drain the battery and leave the driver stranded. This happened to Johnny Carson, one of the company's own investors, shortly after receiving his car. He was left on the side of the road in a vehicle that his own money had helped build. DMC established quality assurance centers across the United States to fix incoming cars before delivery. It was an expensive solution to a problem that should not have existed at launch. The cost of running those centers was real, ongoing, and never fully accounted for in the original financial projections. By the time the 1982 model year opened, quality at Dunmurry had genuinely improved. The workforce had gained experience. The processes had tightened. The cars coming off the line in early 1982 were substantially better than the cars that had left in early 1981. It did not matter. The reputation had already formed. In January 1982, the company sold 350 cars. The previous October, it had sold 720. The trajectory was not a slow decline. It was a collapse. In February 1982, with debts exceeding $175 million and no credible path to solvency, the Dunmurry factory was placed into receivership. The administrators took control. DeLorean was removed from day-to-day operations. An investigation was opened into where the British government's money had actually gone. Production limped on at reduced capacity through the spring, sustained only by the need to complete cars already partially assembled on the line. In March, telegrams were sent to all 343 DeLorean dealerships in America, requesting that each purchase 6 additional vehicles to help stabilize the company. Not one dealership responded with a sales order. In May 1982, production at Dunmurry stopped entirely. The assembly lines went quiet. The test track sat empty. 2,500 workers came to work and found, in the particular silence of a factory that has stopped making things, that the dream was over, even if no one had yet said the word. They would wait through the summer. DeLorean would try to raise 10 million pounds to restart operations. A deadline was set for July. It passed without resolution. The factory that had been built in 16 months in a war zone by people who had never built cars was finished. What came next was something else entirely. While the factory was dying on the assembly floor, a different kind of rot had been spreading at the top of the company for years. It had been invisible to the workers at Dunmurry, invisible to the British government officials who had signed the checks, invisible, or at least deniable, to the investors who had written their names beside John DeLorean's on the funding documents. But it was there, layered, deliberate, and staggering in its audacity. The first layer was the money. When DeLorean secured his government funding, a portion of it was directed toward engineering and technical development, specifically to a company called GPD Services, incorporated in Geneva, Switzerland. GPD was contracted to manage the development of the DMC-12, and DeLorean paid it an advance of $17.3 million, sourced almost entirely from the British Exchequer. Between April 1979 and December 1981, a further £11.5 million flowed from DeLorean Motor Cars Limited to GPD for what the books described as ongoing technical development. When the receivers arrived in 1982 and began tracing the money, they found that it had not been spent on engineering. It had been divided. John DeLorean took a share. Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus Cars, who had been contracted to assist with vehicle development, took a share. Chapman's accountant, Fred Bushell, took a share. The money had moved through a web of offshore accounts and shell arrangements with the kind of precision that suggested long premeditation. Colin Chapman died of a heart attack in December 1982, weeks after the factory closed, before he could be charged with anything. Fred Bushell eventually stood trial in 1992 and served 3 years in prison. A judge sentencing Bushell remarked on the record that he would have liked to sentence John DeLorean to 10 years for what he described as barefaced, outrageous, and massive fraud. DeLorean himself successfully avoided extradition to the United Kingdom for the remainder of his life. The second layer was the lifestyle. While the factory at Dunmurry was running out of money, DeLorean was paying himself and his wife Christina, who sat on the board of one of his companies, salaries in excess of $300,000 per year. He maintained luxury properties in London and New York. He flew between continents on Concorde. He appeared at industry events and in magazine profiles, while the workers he had recruited from the unemployment lines of West Belfast went months without certainty about whether their wages would clear. He was, by multiple accounts, rarely seen at Dunmurry. The explanation offered at various points was a credible-sounding IRA death threat, a claim that many who knew the situation regarded as another layer of theater from a man who had spent his career performing conviction. Whether the threat was real or manufactured, its practical effect was the same. The man whose name was on the gate almost never walked through it. The third layer was the political miscalculation. DeLorean had built his entire survival strategy around the belief that the British government could not afford the political cost of closing his factory. 2,500 jobs in one of the most volatile regions in the United Kingdom, a flagship investment in a peace initiative. The optics of abandonment, he believed, were too damaging for any government to accept. He had not accounted for Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher's approach to industrial subsidy was not sentimental. She had watched British Leyland absorb government money for years with diminishing returns and had drawn conclusions from it. The DeLorean factory was, in her assessment, a poorly structured investment in a company run by a man whose financial practices were becoming increasingly difficult to defend. When her government was asked to extend further support in 1982, the answer was effectively no. Not an outright refusal, but a conditional demand that DeLorean match any government funding with private investment of equal size. DeLorean could not find the private investment. The government did not extend the funding. The factory went into receivership on schedule. What the workers at Dunmurry understood, too late, was that they had never been the point. They had been the argument. The human evidence DeLorean presented to governments and investors to justify the money he needed. When the argument stopped working, they stopped mattering. There was a fourth layer, and it was the one that nobody in the boardroom had ever seriously addressed. The car itself was wrong for the market it was entering. Not wrong in concept. The concept was genuinely original. Not wrong in appearance. The stainless steel body and gull-wing doors produced a silhouette that stopped people cold on the street. But wrong in execution, wrong in timing, and wrong in price in ways that compounded each other into something fatal. The DMC-12 arrived in January 1981, the precise moment the American new car market had entered its sharpest contraction in decades. The 1980 recession had driven interest rates to historic highs. Car loans were expensive. Discretionary spending had collapsed. The buyers who might have stretched to $25,000 for an exotic sports car in 1979 were by 1981 stretching for nothing. The car that arrived into this market was underpowered by the standards of its price category, slower than its own promotional literature claimed, and available in exactly one color, silver, because the stainless steel body could not be painted at the factory. Every DeLorean on every lot in America looked identical. Dealers who wanted to differentiate their inventory began painting cars themselves, an aftermarket modification that immediately voided the central promise of the vehicle's design. The engine was the most fundamental problem. The PRV V6, shared with Peugeot, Renault, and Volvo, had been designed in the early 1970s as a reliable, efficient unit for European family cars. It produced 130 horsepower in the DeLorean application. The Corvette, at $18,000, produced 190. The Porsche 911, which occupied a similar cultural space in the sports car market, was faster, sharper, and backed by decades of performance credibility. DeLorean had promised a car that would outlast everything else on the road. He had delivered exactly that, but the American sports car buyer in 1981 was not primarily buying longevity. They were buying the feeling of acceleration, the confidence of performance, the knowledge that when the light turned green, they would not be embarrassed. The DMC-12 could not reliably provide that feeling. What the car could provide, and provided absolutely and was presence. Standing still, it was extraordinary. The doors rising toward the sky, the brushed steel catching light at every angle. The low, aggressive stance that suggested speed it could not quite deliver. It was a car built for arrival. For the moment the door opened and you stepped out. For the photograph, not the drive. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, the quality that would eventually make the car immortal. But in 1981, immortality did not pay the factory's electricity bill. There was also the matter of the recession's specific cruelty to this particular vehicle. The DeLorean was not just expensive, it was expensive in a way that offered no practical justification. A buyer spending $25,000 in 1981 could purchase a Corvette with money left over, or a well-equipped domestic sedan, or make a down payment on a house. The DeLorean offered instead a stainless steel statement of faith in a man whose company was already, by that point, in the financial press for the wrong reasons. The whispers had started by mid-1981. Questions about the GPD money, questions about the offshore accounts, questions about why a company burning through government funds at this rate was simultaneously paying its founder to fly Concorde to New York. Dealers heard the whispers, buyers heard the dealers. By the time the receivership was announced in February 1982, it surprised almost no one who had been paying attention. What surprised people, what would continue to surprise people for the rest of the year, was what John DeLorean did next. Rather than accept the collapse, accept the investigation, accept the legal exposure that was building on both sides of the Atlantic, he kept moving. He flew to Los Angeles. He took meetings. He told anyone who would listen that the factory was viable, that the cars were selling, that the British government had betrayed a solvent company for political reasons. And somewhere in the course of that desperate movement, he crossed a line that no amount of charm or courtroom brilliance could fully erase. The summer of 1982 passed. The factory sat idle. The workers waited. October was coming. The summer of 1982 in Dunmurry was defined by a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a factory that had never operated, that would have been easier to accept. This was the silence of a factory that had run 3 shifts, that had filled the air with the sound of metal on metal and the smell of industrial solvents and the specific human noise of 2,500 people doing something they had learned to be proud of. That silence, the silence left behind by a sound you knew intimately, is a different weight entirely. Production had stopped in May. The assembly lines were cold. The test track beside the building sat empty, its surface marked by the tire traces of 9,000 cars that would never be followed by a 10,000th. The workers still came in. Not to build. There was nothing to build. But because the receivers had not yet made a final determination, because DeLorean was still publicly insisting that the company could be saved, and because for many of these men and women, the factory was the only formal employment they had ever known. They came in and they waited, the way people wait when they already know the answer, but cannot yet bring themselves to say it. DeLorean, meanwhile, was working the phones from America. The receivers had set a condition, £10 million in new private investment by July 1982, and production could restart. It was a number that, against the backdrop of the company's history, seemed almost modest. DeLorean had raised hundreds of millions in his career. He had convinced governments and celebrities and institutional investors to back him on the strength of his conviction alone. July came. The deadline passed. The £10 million did not materialize. In Dunmurry, the workers received the news the way people received news they have been expecting. Not with shock, but with the particular exhaustion of a hope that had been sustained past its natural life. Many of them had been reading the signals for months, the telegram to the 343 dealerships, the silence from America. The investigators moving through the offices, asking questions about accounts and transfers, and a company in Geneva that none of the factory workers had ever heard of. Nick Sutton, who documented the story of the Dunmurry plant in detail, captured what those months meant for the people on the floor. The losers in this saga, he wrote, were not John DeLorean, who would go on to fight his legal battles from New Jersey with a team of expensive attorneys. The losers were the 2,500 employees at Dunmurry. Many of them never worked again. That sentence carries the full weight of what happened in West Belfast in 1982. These were not workers who had other options waiting. They had come from communities where 50% male unemployment was not a statistic, but a lived condition, where the DeLorean factory had represented, for a few years genuinely, a way out of a cycle that the rest of the city had long since stopped believing could be broken. They had learned skills. They had earned wages. They had sent children to schools with new shoes and paid rent without anxiety for the first time in their adult lives. And then it stopped. Barry Willis, who had served as director of purchasing at the Dunmurry plant, would later draw a comparison that caught the particular texture of the loss. The ship and the car, he said, were both failures. But they were both glorious failures. He meant the Titanic, built a few miles away by an earlier generation of Belfast workers who had also put everything into something that did not survive contact with the world. The comparison was not meant as comfort. It was meant as testimony that the thing they built was real, that the effort was genuine, that the failure, when it came, belonged to forces larger than the people on the factory floor. Whether that distinction mattered to a man who would never work again is another question entirely. By August 1982, the investigation into DeLorean's finances had moved from whisper to documented reality. The receivers combing through the books found what the offshore accounts had obscured for years. The GPD services arrangement, $17.3 million of British government money paid in advance to a Geneva company, followed by £11.5 million more, had not produced the engineering work it was contracted to deliver. The money had moved. It had been divided between DeLorean, Colin Chapman, and Fred Bushell through a structure of layered transactions designed to be difficult to follow. Chapman was already ill. He would be dead by December. Bushell retained lawyers. DeLorean, from across the Atlantic, denied everything and accused the British government of closing a viable company for political reasons, claiming with the particular boldness that had defined his entire career that the factory had millions in the bank and 2 years of dealer orders on its books at the time of closure. The investigators did not find evidence to support that claim. What they found instead was a company that had consumed over $100 million of public money, produced approximately 9,000 cars in less than 2 years, and left behind a factory full of workers and a balance sheet that could not be reconciled with the promises that had been made to obtain the funding in the first place. In Dunmurry, a skeleton crew remained, enough workers to complete the final partially assembled cars still sitting on the stop line. It was quiet, precise work, the kind of work that feels like closing a wound. Each car finished was one fewer reason for anyone to remain. When the last of those cars was done, there would be nothing left to do. Outside the factory gates, the broader reality of West Belfast had not softened. The hunger strikes of 1981 had torn through the city with a force that even the factory's 2 separate entrances could not entirely insulate its workers from. 10 Republican prisoners had died in the Maze prison between March and October of that year. The rioting that followed each death had spilled through the streets of Twinbrook and across the wider area. Workers came to their shifts through neighborhoods that had been burning the night before. They clocked in, built cars, and clocked out into a city that was simultaneously being pulled apart by forces that had nothing to do with gull-wing doors or stainless steel. The factory had always been, at some level, a performance of normalcy in a place where normalcy was not available. 2 communities, 2 gates, 1 assembly line. The architecture of a peace that did not yet exist, imposed on a geography where the war was still being fought in real time. By the autumn of 1982, even the performance was over. The last completed DeLoreans were loaded and shipped. The stamping dies and the heavy metal tools that had shaped the stainless steel panels were not, contrary to later legend, sunk into the sea by an infuriated government. They were sold for scrap value. Some tooling components that ended up at the bottom of water had been repurposed as weights for a salmon hatchery. The factory's remaining parts inventory was dispersed. Pieces of the Dunmurry operation scattered across the Atlantic, absorbed into the supply chains and private collections and repair shops of a car community that was already, even before the company had formally died, developing a cult following for a vehicle that could not be purchased new anymore. The workers cleared their lockers. The gates, both of them, were locked. 2,500 people walked out of Dunmurry for the last time and re-entered a West Belfast that had not changed because they had briefly left it. The unemployment they returned to was the same unemployment they had come from. The only difference was that now they knew exactly what they had lost. October was 1 week away, and in Los Angeles, John DeLorean was about to walk into a hotel room that would define the rest of his life. October 19th, 1982. The announcement came through official channels in the flat language that governments use when they have made a decision they do not wish to debate. The British government would not provide further support to DeLorean Motor Cars Limited. The Dunmurry factory was to be closed, permanently, effective immediately. In West Belfast, the news arrived the way most bad news arrives in working communities, not through a single dramatic moment, but through a series of small confirmations of what people already knew. A phone call, a conversation at a gate, someone's brother who worked in the offices saying that the administrators had been seen carrying boxes. The specific texture of an ending that has been approaching for months, finally making contact with the present tense. 2,500 jobs, gone in a sentence. For the workers of Twinbrook and Dunmurry, the Catholic side and the Protestant side, the two communities that had shared a factory floor while continuing to live in a city that was trying to kill itself, the closure landed with a weight that went beyond unemployment. They had been told explicitly, by the British government and by John DeLorean himself, that this factory was different, that it was not just a place to make cars, that it was evidence of something possible, that industry could grow from conflict, that work could do what politics had failed to do, that two communities who entered through different gates might, over time, find that the gates mattered less than the floor they shared. That argument died on October 19th along with the jobs. What remained was the particular bitterness of people who had invested belief, not just labor, in something that turned out to have been, at its foundation, someone else's financial instrument. The workers had not been wrong to believe. The hope had been real. The work had been real. The cars, 9,000 of them, built by people who had never built cars before, were real, and most of them still existed, and would continue to exist long after the factory that produced them had been absorbed into an industrial estate. But belief, in the end, does not pay redundancy. In the weeks that followed, the human arithmetic of the closure began to resolve itself into individual stories. Men in their 40s and 50s, with skills specific to a factory that no longer existed, in a city with an unemployment rate that had not meaningfully improved since before the factory opened. Men who had used their DeLorean wages to buy houses, to start families, to send children to university, and who now faced the calculation of whether those houses could be maintained on whatever the government would provide while they looked for work that, for many of them, would never come. Nick Sutton's assessment was precise and unsparing. The management team, he noted, largely found other positions. John DeLorean retained his New Jersey estate, his legal team, and his capacity for self-reinvention. The 2,500 workers at Dunmurry had none of those resources. Many of them never worked again. In a city already carrying the weight of the troubles, the closure of the DeLorean factory added a specific, localized grief. The grief of a community that had been given a reason to believe the future was negotiable, and then had that reason taken away. The gates locked. The silence settled. 5,000 miles to the west, in a different time zone, in a different world, the other half of October 19th was just beginning. John DeLorean had flown in from New York. He was 57 years old, silver-haired, still carrying the physical presence that had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American industry. He believed he was meeting with investors. A man named James Hoffman had made the introduction. A neighbor, someone DeLorean knew casually, someone who had presented himself as a conduit to money that could restart the Dunmurry operation. DeLorean needed approximately $17 million to pull the company out of its current position. He had been searching for that money for months, through banks, through private equity, through anyone who would take a meeting with a man whose company was in receivership but whose name still carried enough weight to get him in the room. Hoffman had told him the investors were serious, that the money was real, that this meeting in a hotel near Los Angeles International Airport was the one that would change everything. What DeLorean did not know What he would not know until federal agents came through the door was that James Hoffman was an FBI informant, a career criminal with drug trafficking convictions of his own, cooperating with the Bureau in exchange for leniency on his own case. Hoffman had read about DeLorean's financial difficulties in the Wall Street Journal and had approached the FBI with a proposition. He could deliver John DeLorean into a cocaine trafficking sting. The Bureau had agreed. The meeting in the hotel room was not with investors. It was with undercover federal agents posing as narcotics financiers. The proposition on the table was not an equity investment in DeLorean motor cars. It was a scheme to move 220 pounds of cocaine, worth approximately $24 million, into the United States, with DeLorean providing financial infrastructure for the operation in exchange for a share of the proceeds, large enough to recapitalize his company. FBI cameras recorded everything. On tape, DeLorean could be seen discussing the arrangement. He raised a glass of champagne. He described the cocaine in the room as better than gold. The footage was clear, the audio was clear, and the agents watching the monitors in the adjacent room had what they believed was an airtight case against one of the most famous businessmen in America. Then the door opened and the agents came in. DeLorean was arrested on 8 counts, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, and multiple charges related to possession and intent to distribute, covering a total quantity in excess of 1,000 kilograms, valued at approximately $24 million. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 60 years in federal prison. The news reached Belfast within hours. 2,500 workers had lost their jobs that morning. The man responsible for those jobs was now in federal custody in Los Angeles, photographed in handcuffs outside a hotel, charged with attempting to fund his company through a cocaine deal. The image, DeLorean in custody, the factory closed, both on the same day, was so compressed, so complete in its devastation, that it seemed almost too constructed to be real. What do you make of a man like that? A man who had stood in front of the people of West Belfast and offered them the future, who had taken their labor and their belief and their years, and who, on the day his factory closed, was standing in a hotel room in Los Angeles with a suitcase full of cocaine and a glass of champagne. The workers of Dunmorey had no answer. Neither, for a long time, did anyone else. What came next was 2 years of courtrooms testimony and a verdict that surprised almost everyone, including, by some accounts, John DeLorean himself. The federal trial of John Zachary DeLorean opened in Los Angeles on April 18, 1984. By that point, the DeLorean Motor Company had been bankrupt for 18 months. The Dunmorey factory had been dark for longer. The workers had long since stopped waiting for a reversal that was not coming. But the trial drew the kind of attention that the car itself had once drawn. Not because people expected resolution, but because the story was too strange, too layered, too cinematically constructed to look away from. The prosecution's case appeared on its surface to be unassailable. They had videotape. They had audio recordings. They had a defendant who could be seen on camera raising a champagne glass and describing cocaine as better than gold. They had transcripts of multiple meetings in which DeLorean had discussed the mechanics of the deal with apparent willingness. They had James Hoffman, who had facilitated every step of the operation and was prepared to testify in detail about DeLorean's participation. Against this, DeLorean's defense team, led by Howard Weitzman, one of California's most formidable criminal litigators, made a decision that restructured the entire trial. They would not argue that DeLorean was innocent of the conversations on the tape. They would argue that those conversations should never have happened, that the government had manufactured a crime by targeting a financially desperate man with no prior criminal record and engineering a situation specifically designed to produce incriminating footage. The defense put the FBI on trial. Weitzman established, methodically and in detail, the sequence of events that had led to the hotel room. James Hoffman had approached DeLorean, not the reverse. Hoffman had read about DeLorean's financial difficulties in the press and had gone to the FBI with the proposition. The Bureau had not identified DeLorean through independent investigation. Hoffman was a convicted drug trafficker with a direct financial incentive to deliver a high-profile target. The initial call, documented by DeLorean's own secretary through her call log, had come from Hoffman. DeLorean, Weitzman argued, had no predisposition toward criminal activity. He had no prior record, no history of involvement with narcotics, no established connection to the drug trade of any kind. He was a man in financial freefall who had been approached by someone he trusted with a proposition that seemed, in his desperation, like a lifeline, and who had been guided step by government agents into saying things on camera that could be used to destroy him. The jury heard 59 days of testimony across 5 months. They heard the tapes. They heard Hoffman's history as a government informant in his own criminal background. They heard DeLorean's secretary confirm that Hoffman had made the first call. They heard legal experts debate the boundaries of the entrapment defense and its application to a case where the defendant's words on camera were as explicit as these. They heard, underneath all of it, the question that the defense had placed at the center of everything. Not whether John DeLorean had sat in that hotel room and said those words, but whether John DeLorean would ever have been in that hotel room at all without the sustained, deliberate effort of a government informant who needed him there. The jury deliberated for 29 hours over 4 days. August 16, 1984. The courtroom in Los Angeles was full. The verdict had been expected for days, delayed by the methodical pace of a jury that was taking its responsibility seriously. 29 hours of deliberation, 4 days, requests to review specific tape recordings, and to have the judge clarify instructions on conspiracy liability and the entrapment defense. When the clerk began reading, John DeLorean stood at the defense table in a dark suit, silver hair, the same physical composure he had maintained through 5 months of testimony. His wife, Christina, sat behind him. Count 1, not guilty. Count 2, not guilty. The clerk read all 8, every count, not guilty on each one. "Praise the Lord," DeLorean said loudly enough for the room to hear. Jurors who spoke to reporters afterward were direct about their reasoning. The government's conduct had struck them as inappropriate. One described the operation as textbook entrapment. Another said that Hoffman's role, a career criminal with his own charges pending, approaching a financially desperate man he barely knew, guided by agents who provided logistical support at every step, had made it impossible to conclude that DeLorean would have arrived at that hotel room without being delivered there. The acquittal was a genuine legal vindication. Entrapment defenses succeed in fewer than 1% of federal drug cases. DeLorean's legal team had accomplished something statistically rare and tactically extraordinary, but the courtroom door opened onto a world in which none of it mattered in the way it should have. The company was gone. The factory was gone. The 2,500 jobs were gone and had been gone for nearly 2 years. The workers of Dunmurry had not waited for the verdict. They could not afford to wait, in any sense of that word. They had moved on into whatever came next, which for many of them was a long, difficult nothing. DeLorean walked out of the federal courthouse in Los Angeles on August 16, 1984, acquitted of all charges, and stepped into the remainder of a life that the trial had not restored. The fraud charges followed. British investigators had built a case around the GPD services money, the $17 million and the 11.5 million pounds that had flowed through Geneva and disappeared into accounts controlled by DeLorean, Chapman, and Bushell. Chapman was dead. Bushell would eventually serve 3 years. DeLorean fought extradition to the United Kingdom for the rest of his life and succeeded in avoiding it entirely. American fraud and tax charges were filed, settled. More legal proceedings followed through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The New Jersey estate, 434 acres in Bedminster, was eventually sold to satisfy creditors. Donald Trump purchased it and converted it into a golf course. The money was gone. The reputation, in the way that mattered professionally, did not recover. When a reporter asked DeLorean after his acquittal whether he planned to return to the automobile industry, he paused and then delivered the line with the timing of a man who had been living with the punchline for 2 years. "I mean, come on," he said. "Would you buy a used car from me?" It was the funniest thing he ever said publicly, and the saddest, because behind it was the answer. No, nobody was going to buy a used car from John DeLorean. Nobody was going to back a new venture, fund a new factory, or put their name beside his on a document that required trust. The acquittal had cleared him legally. It had not cleared him in the only court that, for a man who built his life on the ability to make people believe in him, ultimately mattered. He spent the rest of his life in New Jersey in diminishing circumstances, cycling through legal proceedings and religious conversions and memoir projects that never fully captured what had actually happened. On March 19, 2005, John Zachary DeLorean died at Overlook Hospital in Summit, New Jersey, from a stroke. He was 80 years old. Only a handful of people attended the funeral. A military honor team was present in recognition of his service during World War II. His tombstone shows a DeLorean DMC-12 with the gull-wing doors open. The factory did not stay empty for long in the physical sense. By 1989, a French automotive supplier named Montupet had taken over the Dunmurry site and begun manufacturing cast aluminum cylinder heads for the global car industry. General Motors, Ford, Peugeot, Citroën, the same companies that had defined the world DeLorean had tried to disrupt, were now receiving components from the building he had left behind. The factory that had briefly made the most recognizable car in the world was now making parts that would never be seen, buried inside engines that nobody would ever open. It was unglamorous work. It was also steady, skilled, and real. And by the mid-2000s, Montupet's Dunmurry operation employed more than 600 people and had developed a reputation within its French parent company for precision and reliability that the workers themselves regarded with quiet pride. The test track survived. Largely intact, its surface worn but its layout unchanged, it sat alongside the repurposed factory as a piece of industrial archaeology, the only physical evidence, for those who knew what they were looking at, that something extraordinary had briefly happened here. DeLorean enthusiasts, organized into clubs that spanned the United Kingdom and Ireland and reached across to America, began holding reunion events at the site. They brought their cars, the surviving DMC-12s, roughly 6,500 of them still in existence worldwide, and drove them on the track where every one of their predecessors had been tested before shipping. There was something in those gatherings that resisted easy sentiment but demanded acknowledgement anyway. These were cars that had been built by people with no automotive experience in a factory constructed in 16 months on a peat bog in a war zone, under circumstances that no business school case study would ever recommend. The fact that 2/3 of them still existed, still running, still recognizable, still capable of stopping people on the street, was a testament to something. Not to John DeLorean necessarily, to the workers who had built them. For the 2,500 people who had lost their jobs in October 1982, the recovery was uneven in the way that recoveries in working communities always are, meaning that some people found their footing and many did not, and the ones who did not were not the ones who received the most attention in the years that followed. The British government's handling of the closure added a specific injury to the general one. In the aftermath of the bankruptcy, administrators identified what they described as surplus funds within the DeLorean motor cars loaded at pension scheme. The government sequestered 990,000 pounds of that surplus, money that had accumulated in a fund intended for the retirement security of the Dunmurry workforce, and absorbed it into the broader financial settlement of the company's collapse. The workers who had contributed to that pension through their wages received no share of the surplus that their contributions had helped create. It was a decision that, in the accounting of how the DeLorean story treated the people at its center, sits alongside the fraud and the sting operation and the doubled production orders as evidence of a system that processed working people as variables in calculations made by others. The workers of Twinbrook and Dunmurry, Catholic and Protestant, entering through their separate gates, building the same cars on the same floor, had been from the beginning the human justification for a financial and political arrangement that was never primarily about them. When that arrangement ended, they were left with what they had built and nothing else. What they had built, it turned out, was enough to outlast everything that had failed around it. The cars did not rust, the test track remained, and the community of people who cared about the DMC-12, who restored them, drove them, researched their production histories, and hunted down their original components, kept returning to Dunmurry, kept bringing the cars home, kept insisting that what had happened here deserved to be remembered on its own terms. Barry Willis, who had spent years inside the factory as director of purchasing, put it with the compression of someone who had thought about it for a long time. The ship and the car, he said, were both failures. But they were both glorious failures. He meant it as dignity, as the specific dignity of people who built something real under impossible conditions and watched it taken from them by forces they had never controlled and could never have anticipated. That dignity does not appear on any balance sheet. It does not show up in the receivership documents or the fraud trial transcripts or the FBI surveillance footage from a hotel room near LAX, but it is there, in the cars, in the track, in the workers who built both. In 1985, 3 years after the factory closed and 1 year after the acquittal, a film called Back to the Future opened in cinemas across America. Director Robert Zemeckis had originally planned to use a refrigerator as his time machine. The logic was practical. A large boxy appliance could plausibly contain the flux capacitor in the various mechanical elements the script required. Steven Spielberg, producing the film, overruled the idea on safety grounds. He was concerned that children watching the movie would climb into refrigerators and freezers while playing make-believe, and that some of them would not come out. The replacement needed to look like it came from somewhere else, like it had arrived from a different time and carried the evidence of that journey in its shape. It needed to stop people cold the moment it appeared on screen. Zemeckis chose the DeLorean DMC-12. The choice was, in retrospect, the most consequential thing that ever happened to the car, more consequential than its launch, its reviews, its sales figures, its founder's arrest, or its factory's closure. The film earned nearly $400 million worldwide. It became one of the most watched movies in American history. And the stainless steel car with the gull-wing doors, the car that had failed to sell enough units to keep a factory alive, became the most famous vehicle on Earth. The workers of Dunmurry learned about the film the way most people learned about things in 1985. Gradually, through conversation and cinema cues, and the specific surprise of seeing something you made with your hands appear on a screen larger than the factory floor where you made it. The car they had built, the car that had cost them their jobs, that had been the instrument of a promise that was broken, was now immortal. The irony was not lost on anyone. John DeLorean had promised a car that would outlast everything else on the road. He had been right in a way he could not have predicted and did not live to fully appreciate. The DMC-12 outlasted his company, his reputation, his legal battles, his estate in New Jersey, and his life. It outlasted the factory that built it, and the government arrangement that funded it, and the FBI sting operation that ended it. It outlasted, in cultural terms, almost everything that surrounded its brief existence. Approximately 6,500 DeLoreans remain in existence today, roughly 70% of total production. They do not rust. The stainless steel body, the quality that critics in 1981 dismissed as a gimmick, turned out to be the car's most durable promise kept. Every surviving DeLorean looks externally almost identical to the day it left Dunmurry. The doors still open toward the sky. The brushed steel still catches light the way it caught light on the test track in West Belfast, when a worker who had never driven a sports car in his life climbed in for the first time and took it around the banking corner at 50 miles per hour before signing off on delivery. That worker is in his 60s or 70s now. The car he signed off on may be in a garage in California, or a collection in Japan, or on a street in Dublin, where someone stops to take a photograph and does not know that the machine they are photographing was built by a man from Twinbrook who came through the left gate. The DeLorean has joined that small category of objects, the Titanic, the Concorde, the Apollo lunar module, that are remembered not despite their failure, but because of it. Objects whose ambition exceeded their execution by exactly the right amount to make them permanent. Failures so complete, so spectacular, so human in their construction and their collapse, that they became more interesting than success would have allowed them to be. Barry Willis understood this. The ship and the car, he said, both failures, both glorious. The Titanic was built by Belfast workers and sank on its maiden voyage, and has been the subject of more books, films, exhibitions, and human fascination than any ship that successfully completed its journey. The DeLorean was built by Belfast workers and failed to sell enough units to survive its second year of production, and has been the subject of more cultural attention, more devoted restoration, more sustained affection than any sports car of its era. Belfast has a habit of building things that outlast their disasters. What the workers of Dunmurry made, the 2,500 men and women who came through two separate gates and shared one factory floor during some of the worst years their city had ever known, was not just a car, it was evidence. Evidence that the work was real, that the effort was genuine, that the people who did it were capable of something extraordinary under conditions that would have stopped most factories before the first shift ended. John DeLorean took a great deal from those people. He took their labor and their belief, and through the pension, sequestration, and the collapse promises, something of their future. But he could not take what they had already made. The cars exist. They will continue to exist. Stainless steel does not accommodate regret. Somewhere in Belfast tonight, there is probably a DeLorean DMC-12 with its gull-wing doors open, catching the light the way it always has, indifferent to everything that surrounded its creation: the fraud, the sting operation, the receivership, the hunger strikes in the streets beyond the fence, the two gates that should have been one. It was built here, in this city, by these people. That part, at least, was always true.